In 1966, a group of anthropologists sat with stopwatches in the Kalahari Desert, tracking every single minute of a group of adults for weeks, expecting to document a population working themselves to exhaustion just to stay alive. Instead, the data showed something almost nobody expected. The adults they were tracking spent an average of around 2 hours a day, sometimes less, actually gathering or hunting food. The rest of the daylight hours were spent resting, talking, making tools, playing, and doing what could only be described, in the anthropologist's own notes, as an enormous amount of nothing in particular. A work week shorter than most modern office jobs, sustained for tens of thousands of years without a single calendar, alarm clock, or employer. That single dataset quietly overturned one of the most confident assumptions in all of anthropology, and it's the same assumption most people still carry around today without realizing it. For most of human history, a day was not a schedule imposed on a body from the outside. It was a shape the body and the sky produced together, hour by hour, without a clock anywhere in sight. Start with the version of a day most familiar today. An alarm interrupts sleep at a fixed time, regardless of how the body actually feels. Work begins on a schedule set by someone else, often somewhere else entirely. Meals happen when a clock permits them, not necessarily when hunger arrives. Artificial light extends the evening for hours past sunset, and sleep gets pushed later and later to make room for it. The day is, in a very real sense, engineered by institutions, not by the body or the sun. Now hold that against the record left behind by anthropologists, who have spent decades living alongside, observing, and in some cases literally timing, communities whose daily rhythms remained close to how humans organized time for the overwhelming majority of the species' existence, before agriculture, before clocks, before electric light. That record, pieced together from groups including the Hadza of Tanzania, the Jew hoansi San of the Kalahari, the Piraha of the Amazon, and others, does not describe a single universal ancient day. It describes something more interesting, a set of recurring rhythms appearing again and again across unrelated environments and continents, structured by light, temperature, hunger, and social need rather than by any external authority. Following one of these days from the first light of dawn to the last light of dusk reveals a structure almost nothing like the modern one, and reveals, too, exactly what got lost when clocks and electric light took over the job the sun used to do alone. This video follows that day, in order, hour by hour, anchored at every stage to specific fieldwork, specific researchers, and specific data drawn primarily from populations still living, or living until very recently, in ways closer to how the species spent most of its existence. None of what follows should be read as a single monolithic template. Different environments produce different rhythms, but the underlying architecture, driven by light and need rather than by schedule and obligation, shows up with striking consistency across every population studied this way. This video draws on fieldwork spanning 3 continents and roughly 6 decades of documentation, from Richard Lee's original 1960s time allocation studies in the Kalahari to Jerome Siegel's 2015 sleep tracking research using modern wearable devices on 3 separate pre-industrial populations at once. Some of the specific communities discussed have changed substantially since the earliest fieldwork cited here, adopting varying degrees of contact with markets, schools, and modern technology in the decades since. Others, including large portions of Hadza and Jew hoansi daily life, retain significant continuity with the patterns documented decades ago. None of this is presented as a frozen snapshot of prehistoric life. It is presented as the closest available evidence for how a day organized primarily by light, temperature, and immediate need, rather than by schedule and institution, actually functions when it can still be directly observed. Begin before sunrise, in the pre-dawn darkness, because that is where the day itself actually begins, and it begins without an alarm. Anthropologist Alyssa Crittenden of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, who has spent years conducting fieldwork among the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer population living around Lake Eyasi in northern Tanzania, has documented that waking in Hadza camps typically happens gradually, tied to the earliest graying of the sky, well before actual sunrise and without any external trigger forcing it. There is no single moment when everyone in a camp wakes simultaneously, and there is no one instructing them to. Individuals rouse themselves as ambient light increases, and as the general stirring of camp life around them builds, a soft, staggered wake-up entirely unlike the abrupt, externally imposed wake-up most modern adults experience through a phone alarm. Crittenden's broader fieldwork among the Hadza, which has also examined childhood nutrition and development, alongside general daily activity patterns, notes that this staggered pre-dawn period often includes some of the day's earliest food preparation and fire tending, small tasks performed at a low-intensity, half-awake pace before the camp's main activities begin in earnest. There is no equivalent in this account to the modern experience of an alarm forcing an immediate, full alertness transition from deep sleep to functional wakefulness within a matter of seconds. The Hadza pre-dawn period, as Crittenden documents it, is instead a gradual ramp matching the sky's own gradual transition from darkness to light rather than the abrupt binary switch a mechanical alarm imposes on a body that may still be deep in a sleep cycle when it goes off. That detail connects to a separate and genuinely striking body of research on sleep itself. Sleep researcher Jerome Siegel of the University of California, Los Angeles, led a study published in the journal Current Biology in 2015 that placed sleep tracking devices on members of three pre-industrial societies with no electricity: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Tisamene of Bolivia. The findings directly contradicted a widely held assumption about ancient sleep. Popular belief held that people without artificial light and modern stress would sleep longer, more deeply, and go to bed the moment it got dark. Siegel's data showed something different. Members of all three groups typically stayed awake for several hours after sunset, sleeping an average of around 6 to 6.5 hours a night. Not the 8 or 9 hours often assumed. What Siegel's research did confirm was something else entirely: near total consistency in wake time tied to the rise in temperature and light just before dawn, rather than any fixed clock-based schedule. The body, freed from artificial light and fixed obligations, wasn't sleeping longer. It was synchronizing tightly to an external environmental signal instead of an internal alarm. So what's actually driving that wake-up, if it isn't willpower or an alarm clock at all? The mechanism is a biological structure researchers call the circadian rhythm, and specifically its sensitivity to light exposure through a part of the eye's retina that doesn't primarily contribute to vision, but instead feeds signals directly to a region of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Sleep researcher Charles Czeisler of Harvard Medical School, whose decades of research have been foundational to understanding how light regulates the human sleep-wake cycle, has shown through controlled studies that even modest amounts of light exposure at the wrong time can shift, delay, or disrupt this internal clock significantly. Czeisler's laboratory research specifically identified blue wavelength light, the kind emitted heavily by both daylight and more recently by phone and computer screens, as unusually powerful at triggering the suprachiasmatic response, more so than other portions of the visible spectrum. Under natural pre-electric conditions, the only meaningful source of blue heavy light was the sun itself, meaning the suprachiasmatic nucleus received an extremely clean, unambiguous signal each morning. Strong blue light means dawn has arrived and the internal clock should begin its hormonal cascade accordingly. Firelight notably sits at the opposite end of that spectrum, rich in warm, red-orange wavelengths and comparatively very low in blue light, which Czeisler's broader body of research suggests is precisely why sitting near a fire for hours after sunset, unlike staring at a modern screen for the same duration, does comparatively little to delay or disrupt the onset of sleep. Fire extended the usable day without confusing the body's dawn detection system. Modern screens, emitting blue heavy light long after actual sunset, appear to do exactly what fire did not: send a false dawn signal deep into the evening, which Czeisler's research connects directly to delayed and disrupted sleep onset in populations with heavy evening screen exposure. In an environment with no artificial light sources at all, that clock has nothing competing with it. Dawn light hits the retina, the suprachiasmatic nucleus responds, and a hormonal cascade begins that gradually lifts the body out of sleep, tied precisely to the actual solar day, not to any number printed on a clock face. Compare that to the environment most people wake up in today, filled with streetlights, screens, and curtains that block the very dawn signal the body evolved to respond to, and the entire mismatch becomes visible. The alarm clock isn't simply a convenience invented to help modern life function. It is, in a very real sense, a technological patch built to compensate for the fact that modern sleeping environments have disabled the original wake-up mechanism entirely. Move forward an hour or two into the earliest part of the Hadza morning, and the day's actual work begins, but not in the way that word usually implies. Anthropologist Frank Marlowe of Durham University, who conducted extensive long-term fieldwork with the Hadza across the early 2000s and published his findings in the 2010 book The Hadza, Hunter-Gatherers of Tanzania, documented a clear and consistent divide in how the morning unfolds. Hadza men, particularly younger men, typically leave camp early to hunt, often traveling considerable distances, sometimes returning empty-handed, since large-game hunting success rates documented in Marlowe's research were often lower than popular imagination assumes. Hadza women, meanwhile, organize into small foraging groups, often including children, and set out to dig for tubers, a reliable and calorie-dense staple that, according to Marlowe's data, actually supplies a larger and more consistent share of the group's total caloric intake across the year than meat does. That detail alone reframes a persistent cultural myth. The image most people carry of ancient daily life, a heroic male hunter single-handedly providing for a dependent group, does not match Marlowe's actual data. Tuber digging by women, a steady, lower-risk, lower-glamour activity, was doing more of the actual caloric heavy lifting, on most days, than the hunt was. Marlowe's fieldwork also documented something specific about how Hadza men decide each morning what kind of hunting to pursue, and the decision itself reveals a level of moment-to-moment flexibility almost totally absent from a modern scheduled workday. A man might set out with a bow, intending to track large game for hours, but shift entirely mid-morning to opportunistic small game hunting or honey collection if tracks go cold or a beehive is spotted along the way. There is no fixed morning agenda being followed. The plan is reformed continuously against real-time information the environment provides, a style of labor closer to constant improvisation than to task list execution. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, in fieldwork conducted alongside Hadza-focused research teams during the 1980s, documented a further wrinkle worth naming directly. Men frequently pursued large game specifically because of its social and reputational value within camp. Even when the caloric math, given how often large game hunts failed to produce a kill, favored smaller, more reliable prey or plant foods instead. Hunting, in other words, wasn't purely a caloric strategy. It was also functioning as a status display, a detail that complicates the simple story of a morning spent purely on survival math. Honey collection specifically deserves its own mention here, because Marlowe's data identifies it as an unusually significant part of the Hadza diet, one that rarely makes it into popular depictions of ancient foraging life at all. Locating a wild beehive, smoking out the bees using a smoldering bundle of grass or bark, and extracting the honeycomb, often from a considerable height in a baobab tree, represents a genuinely skilled, moderately dangerous activity that Marlowe's fieldwork found contributing a meaningful share of total caloric intake. Particularly appealing given honey's unusually high, easily digestible sugar content compared to most other available foods in the environment. A morning that began with a plan to track large game might end, instead, with an afternoon spent almost entirely on the considerably safer, and often more reliably successful, business of raiding a beehive instead. But listen to what happens next, because the amount of time this work actually consumes is where the real surprise sits. Anthropologist Richard Borshay Lee, whose fieldwork among the Jew hoansi san of the Kalahari Desert beginning in the 1960s produced some of the most influential data in the history of hunter-gatherer studies, conducted a detailed time allocation study published in his research through the late 1960s and formally analyzed in the landmark 1968 conference and subsequent publication Man the Hunter. Lee's data found that Jew hoansi adults spent, on average, somewhere between 15 and 20 hours per week on subsistence activities directly related to acquiring food, a figure dramatically lower than the exhausting scarcity-driven existence most people assumed hunter-gatherer life required. Anthropologist Marshall Solins, drawing directly on Lee's data in his own highly influential 1972 essay, gave this idea its now famous name: the original affluent society, a deliberately provocative label built on the observation that so-called primitive societies, despite having far fewer material possessions, may have had dramatically more leisure time than people in industrialized, wealth-accumulating economies. Here's the disturbing part, and it's disturbing specifically because of what it implies about the trade humanity eventually made. If Lee and Solins's data holds, and Marlowe's later Hadza research broadly supports a similar picture, then the transition to agriculture, and eventually to industrial labor, didn't simply improve on a harsh, work-filled ancient existence. In terms of hours spent laboring per week, it may have made things measurably worse for enormous stretches of human history, trading a shorter, lower-stress workday for a longer, more rigid one, in exchange for food surpluses, storage, and population growth. Not every population organizes even this relatively light workload the same way, and the differences matter because they show that ancient rhythm was never one single script performed identically everywhere. Linguist and anthropologist Daniel Everett, whose extended fieldwork living among the Piraha people of the Brazilian Amazon spanned decades beginning in the 1970s and was detailed extensively in his 2008 book Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, documented a population whose daily and even nightly rhythm diverges sharply from the Hadza and Jew hoansi pattern already described. Everett's account describes the Piraha as deliberately resistant to accumulating stored food or planning multiple days in advance, instead favoring frequent smaller foraging trips timed close to when food would actually be needed, a strategy Everett connected to a broader Piraha cultural emphasis on immediate experience over long-range planning. Even sleep followed a strikingly different pattern in Everett's account. Rather than one consolidated nighttime sleep period, Piraha adults frequently napped in short bursts throughout both day and night, waking periodically to talk, tend to fire, or simply remain alert, a pattern Everett linked partly to a stated cultural value around not sleeping too deeply or too long, tied to real anxieties about jaguars and other nighttime dangers in the surrounding forest. That detail is worth holding on to specifically because it complicates any temptation to describe a single universal ancient human day. The Hadza and Jew hoansi data point toward a fairly consolidated single nighttime sleep period following an active firelit evening. Everett's Piraha data points towards something closer to a distributed, polyphasic pattern of short sleep bouts spread across day and night entirely. Both patterns, however, share the same underlying architecture this video keeps returning to: sleep and waking driven by real, immediate environmental and social signals. predator risk, temperature, firelight, hunger, rather than by any externally imposed, environment-independent schedule. The specific shape of the rhythm varied by environment. The principle producing that shape, tight coupling to real-time conditions rather than to an abstract clock, did not. Everett's account adds one further detail worth noting, because it shows how directly environmental danger, rather than any abstract cultural preference, shaped the Piraha sleep pattern specifically. The Piraha phrase Everett titled his book after roughly translating to a warning about staying alert because of snakes reflects a genuinely practical concern in the riverside Amazonian environment the Piraha inhabit, where venomous snakes and other nocturnal hazards make deep, prolonged, unbroken sleep measurably riskier than it would be in a more predator-sparse environment like the Hadza's savanna or the Kalahari's open scrubland. The Piraha's polyphasic, lightly sleeping pattern, in other words, appears to be a direct, sensible adaptation to a specific, locally dangerous nighttime environment. Further reinforcing the broader point this video keeps returning to, the ancestral day was never one fixed template applied uniformly everywhere. It was a flexible system, endlessly reshaped by whatever specific dangers, resources, and climate conditions a given environment actually presented. Push forward into the heat of midday, because this is where the daily rhythm, at least for populations in hot, exposed environments like the Hadza and the Jew hoansi, takes one of its sharpest and most physically grounded turns. Anthropologist Nicholas Blurton Jones, whose research alongside colleagues on Hadza activity patterns has documented daily behavior across multiple field seasons, along with independent thermoregulation research on sand populations, conducted by physiologist duo, including work published by researchers at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, has shown that activity in these environments drops sharply during the hottest hours of the day, typically from roughly late morning through mid-afternoon depending on season. This isn't laziness or a cultural preference. It's a direct physiological response to an environment where sustained physical exertion during peak heat carries genuine risk of dangerous overheating, particularly in populations without access to the cooling technology modern life takes for granted. During this stretch, camp activity shifts toward shade, rest, food processing, tool maintenance, and social interaction, rather than active foraging or hunting. Crittenden's Hadza research specifically documents this midday lull as a consistent near-universal feature of the daily rhythm, distinct from a modern lunch break in one crucial way. It isn't a scheduled interruption of continuous work. It's closer to the day's actual center of gravity, the period the rest of the day is structured around, rather than a brief pause squeezed in between two blocks of labor. So what's actually happening biologically during those hours of apparent inactivity, beyond simply staying cool? This is where a substantial amount of the day's real social infrastructure gets built. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner, whose fieldwork among the Judu Hoansi San, conducted across multiple decades beginning in the 1970s, culminated in a widely cited 2014 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, found a striking pattern in how daytime and nighttime conversation differed. Wiesner's analysis of recorded conversations showed that daytime talk among the Jew Hoansi was overwhelmingly practical. Economic matters, complaints, criticism, coordination, and problem-solving, the daylight version of what a modern person might call logistics and gossip. It was only after dark, once the fires were lit, that conversation shifted dramatically toward storytelling, an entire category of talk that occupied a comparatively tiny share of daytime hours, but a dominant share of nighttime hours. Evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar of the University of Oxford, whose research on the social function of conversation spans several decades, offers a complementary explanation for why so much of that daytime talk skewed toward what looks, from the outside, like idle complaint and social monitoring. Dunbar's research, based on recorded conversation samples across a range of modern and traditional contexts, has repeatedly found that a substantial share, often estimated in his published work at somewhere around 2/3, of ordinary human conversation concerns social topics. Who did what, who can be trusted, who broke which agreement. The exact material Wiesner documented dominating Hadza and Jupani's housey daytime hours. Dunbar's broader argument, developed across his research beginning in the 1990s, holds that this kind of talk functions as a direct evolutionary substitute for the physical grooming behavior seen in other primates, allowing humans to maintain and monitor a much larger network of social relationships than one-on-one grooming could ever support. Daytime conversation, under this reading, wasn't idle chatter filling dead time during the heat. It was active, ongoing social maintenance, keeping track of reputations, alliances, and obligations across an entire camp, work that had to happen somewhere in the day, and the shaded lower intensity hours of midday turn out to be exactly where the ethnographic record shows it concentrated. That finding sets up something worth sitting with for a moment before moving further into the evening, because it means the daytime hours, heat, rest, foraging, tool work, practical talk, and the nighttime hours, firelight, story, myth, social bonding, were functioning as two entirely different modes of the same day. each doing work the other mode couldn't do. Move into the afternoon once the day's heat begins to break, and a second wave of activity typically resumes, though usually lighter and closer to camp than the morning's foraging push. Marlowe's Hadza research documents this stretch of the day as when tool production, repair work, and processing of the morning's or previous day's food often takes place. Arrow shafts straightened and fletched, digging sticks sharpened, tubers processed for consumption. Crittenden's research adds an important detail specific to childhood during this window. Children in Hadza camps are given substantial independence during these hours, often practicing foraging and tool use skills through direct unsupervised trial and play rather than through anything resembling formal instruction. Anthropologist Barry Hewlett, whose comparative research across multiple hunter-gatherer societies, including extensive fieldwork with the Aka of Central Africa, has documented similar patterns, has argued that this kind of unstructured, self-directed learning through play may be the dominant mode by which foraging societies transmit complex practical knowledge across generations, in sharp contrast to the age-graded, curriculum-based instruction that defines nearly all formal modern education. Now here's the disturbing part, because it inverts a common modern assumption about supervision and safety. Hewlett's research suggests that the near-constant adult supervision, considered standard practice in much of the industrialized world today, would have been, in most documented forager societies, both practically impossible given the demands on adult time, and largely unnecessary given how early and how directly children were integrated into the group's actual subsistence and social activities. Independence wasn't withheld until some later developmental milestone. It was built into the structure of an ordinary afternoon almost from the start. Everything described so far in this video, the timing of waking, the length of the midday lull, the balance between morning foraging and afternoon tool work, was never fixed across the calendar year the way a modern 9-to-5 schedule is. Marlowe's Hadza fieldwork specifically documents substantial seasonal shifts in daily activity patterns, tracking differences between the dry season, when water and food sources become scarce and more concentrated, forcing longer daily travel distances to reach them, and the wet season, when resources are more dispersed but generally more abundant close to camp, allowing shorter, less physically demanding foraging trips. Blurton-Jones's complementary research on Hadza time allocation found that total time spent on subsistence activities could shift measurably between seasons, with dry season demands sometimes pushing work hours noticeably higher than the wet season baseline, even though the overall pattern, hours worked per week, remained consistently far below a standard modern work week in both seasons. That detail matters because it demonstrates something a single-day snapshot could never show on its own. The ancestral daily rhythm wasn't just responsive to light and temperature within a single 24-hour cycle. It was responsive across the entire year, contracting and expanding the workday, the travel distance, and even camp location itself, in direct response to real physical environmental conditions that shifted month to month. A modern calendar, by contrast, holds working hours essentially constant across January and July alike, regardless of what the actual physical environment outside the office window is doing. The ancestral system had no equivalent fixed baseline at all. Every layer of it, waking time, work hours, travel distance, camp location, flexed continuously against real conditions, at the scale of a single day and at the scale of an entire year simultaneously. Push toward the day's final hours as the light begins to lower and the heat breaks fully, because this is where the rhythm shifts toward its most socially concentrated period, and where the true turn in this story begins to take shape. The instinctive assumption, walking into this topic, is that fire's most important function in ancient daily life was practical: cooking food, warmth, protection from predators. That assumption isn't wrong, but according to a substantial body of anthropological and even neurological research, it may be badly incomplete, in a way that changes the entire meaning of what happened once the sun went down. Anthropologist Wisner's research on Jew to hoansi firelight conversation, already referenced earlier, is the clearest documented case of what actually happened once fires were lit each evening. Her data showed that storytelling, the transmission of cultural knowledge, myth, dispute resolution woven into narrative form, and the building and reinforcing of social bonds across the entire camp occurred overwhelmingly during firelit hours rather than during the practical task-focused daylight hours. Wisner argued explicitly, based on this data, that firelight didn't simply illuminate an already existing social practice. It appears to have created the specific social and cognitive conditions that made this kind of extended, imaginative, emotionally rich storytelling possible in the first place. Conditions that the practical demands and visual distractions of full daylight actively worked against. This connects directly to a broader claim developed by primatologist and anthropologist Richard Wrangham of Harvard University, whose influential 2009 book Catching Fire: How Cooking Made Us Human argued that the controlled use of fire, likely established hundreds of thousands of years ago, fundamentally reshaped human biology and society in ways far beyond simply making food easier to chew. Wrangham's argument, drawing on comparative primate energetics and human anatomical evidence, holds that cooked food delivered dramatically more usable calories than raw food, freeing up energy that could be redirected towards supporting an unusually large and metabolically expensive human brain. Wrangham's research is specific about the mechanism behind that caloric gain. Cooking, through heat, partially breaks down the cell walls and protein structures in food before it ever reaches the digestive system, meaning the body has to expend measurably less of its own energy on digestion itself to extract the same nutrients. Comparative studies Wrangham cites, including experiments feeding raw versus cooked diets to other animals, found that raw food diets alone were often insufficient to sustain body weight without supplementation, even when caloric content on paper looked equivalent. Applied to human evolution, Wrangham's argument holds that this digestive efficiency gain, multiplied across every meal every day for hundreds of thousands of years, freed up a genuinely significant energy surplus. And that surplus, rather than simply being stored as fat, appears to have been redirected disproportionately toward brain tissue, among the most metabolically expensive tissue the human body maintains. But fire's second major effect, the one most directly connected to Wisner's storytelling data, was temporal rather than nutritional. Fire extended the usable day. It pushed back the point at which failing light forced a stop to activity, creating, for the first time in the evolutionary record, a reliable block of extra hours each day, with enough light to remain active and social, but with none of the demands, visual distractions, or physical dangers of full daylight. That's the causal reversal worth sitting with, and it's worth naming directly. The common assumption is that ancient humans developed language and storytelling, and then simply happened to use fire as convenient lighting for it once it existed. Wisner and Wrangham's combined research suggests the causality may run the other way. Fire didn't just illuminate an evening that would otherwise have looked the same. Fire manufactured an entirely new category of time, several extra hours daily, that hadn't existed before in the same usable form. And that new block of time, low stakes, socially concentrated, freed from the day's practical demands, may have been the specific evolutionary and cultural pressure that allowed extended storytelling, complex myth, and the deep social bonding Wiesner documented to develop into the central, load-bearing cultural technology they clearly became. Put another way, without fire, there is still a day, and there is presumably still some capacity for language and social exchange within it. But that day ends the moment useful light does, and whatever cultural and social transmission happens has to compete for space against every other daylight demand: foraging, travel, food processing, childcare, defense against predators. Fire didn't add a new activity to an already complete day. It added an entirely new segment of day itself, one specifically emptied of those competing demands by the nature of darkness surrounding it. And it is precisely that emptied, protected, low-competition block of time that Wiesner's data shows filling almost immediately with exactly the kind of extended imaginative, cross-generational storytelling that daylight hours full of competing practical obligations never seem to make comparable room for. This reframes everything that came before in this video. The Jew hoansi's daytime talk, blunt, practical, transactional, wasn't simply a less developed version of their nighttime talk. It was operating under fundamentally different constraints fire's evening hours specifically removed. Before controlled fire existed reliably, the day essentially ended when useful light did, and whatever social and cultural transmission happened compressed into whatever daylight hours weren't already consumed by the practical business of staying alive. After fire, an entirely new second half of the day opened up, purpose-built, in effect, for exactly the kind of activity that built and sustained culture itself. Once that reframing sets in, the earlier midday lull reads differently too. It wasn't simply rest squeezed in to avoid the heat. It was the daylight hours doing daylight-specific job: food, safety, practical coordination, while an entirely separate evening system, unlocked by fire, handled a completely different kind of work, the work of holding a group together across generations through shared story and myth. Which raises the obvious next question sitting underneath the back half of this video. What actually happened once the fires were burning and the practical business of the day was done? Wisner's research and complementary ethnographic accounts from multiple hunter-gatherer societies describe evening firelight gatherings as genuinely cross-generational, involving children, adults, and elders together around the same fire, in sharp contrast to the age-segregated structure of most modern evenings, where children, working adults, and retirees typically spend evening leisure time in largely separate activities and often separate physical spaces entirely. Elders, in Wisner's Jew hoansi data specifically, played an outsized role in storytelling during these hours. A pattern anthropologist and evolutionary biologist, Kristen Hawkes of the University of Utah, has connected to her own influential research on what's often called the grandmother hypothesis. The idea that a long post-reproductive human lifespan may have evolved specifically because older individuals no longer expending energy on their own reproduction could invest that energy instead into supporting grandchildren and transmitting accumulated knowledge, including precisely the kind of cultural knowledge encoded in the myths and stories told around a fire each night. Hawkes's research, developed initially through her own Hadza fieldwork beginning in the 1980s, alongside colleagues including Nicholas Blurton-Jones and James O'Connell, built the grandmother hypothesis on a specific observed pattern. Older Hadza women past reproductive age remained highly active foragers, frequently digging tubers at rates comparable to or exceeding younger women, and the calories they provided disproportionately supported their daughters' young children, rather than their own subsistence needs alone. Hawkes's mathematical modeling, published across multiple papers through the 1990s and 2000s, argued that this pattern of grandmother-subsidized childcare and provisioning could, over evolutionary timescales, select directly for longer female post-reproductive lifespan, since women whose genes inclined them toward living and remaining productive well past menopause would, on average, see more of their grandchildren survive to adulthood. Applied to the evening firelight data, the same logic extends naturally from foraging to storytelling. An elder who no longer needed to spend daylight hours on the most physically demanding subsistence tasks was specifically well-positioned, both in terms of available time and accumulated lifetime knowledge, to become the evening's primary keeper and teller of the group's stories. Consider how deliberately layered this actually is. Once all the pieces are placed side by side, fire extended the day. The extended evening hours, freed from daylight's practical pressures, created the specific conditions for extended storytelling. That storytelling was disproportionately delivered by elders whose evolved extended lifespan, per Hawkes's research, existed specifically to make this kind of late-life knowledge transmission possible. Each mechanism, independently documented by different researchers working in different specialties, locks into the others, describing not three separate phenomena, but three interlocking pieces of a single evolved system for building and preserving culture across generations. Entirely dependent on the specific narrow window of time fire had opened up between the end of useful daylight and the actual need for sleep. Pushed toward the very end of the day now, into the hours immediately before and during sleep itself, because even this final stretch turns out to look almost nothing like its modern equivalent. Return to Siegel's 2015 sleep tracking research across the Hadza, San, and Tissimini populations. Beyond documenting the 6 to 6.5 hour average sleep duration already mentioned, Siegel's data revealed something else worth naming directly. None of the three populations studied showed evidence of the kind of single, uninterrupted 8-hour sleep block that modern sleep advice often treats as the biological gold standard. Instead, sleep in these populations was consistently tied to the drop in ambient temperature after sunset, with individuals typically remaining awake, active, and social for a period of several hours after dark before sleep onset, made possible specifically by firelight before eventually settling into sleep as temperatures continued to fall through the night. Siegel's research team also tracked something specific about waking during the night itself, and the data ran directly against another common assumption. Nighttime waking, brief periods of alertness in the middle of the sleep period, was common across all three groups. But critically, none of the populations studied reported this as a problem, a disorder, or something requiring intervention, the way modern insomnia is typically framed and medicated in industrialized contexts. Siegel's team suggested this points toward a broader mismatch. A substantial share of what gets diagnosed as a sleep disorder in modern clinical settings, brief nighttime waking specifically, may actually represent a normal, ancestral sleep architecture running into a modern cultural expectation, a single unbroken block from lights out to alarm, that the sleeping body itself was never actually built around in the first place. Historian A. Roger Eckhurch of Virginia Tech, whose research digging through pre-industrial European court records, diaries, and medical texts was published in his influential 2005 book At Day's Close, Night and Times Past, independently uncovered a strikingly similar pattern in an entirely different population and an entirely different kind of historical evidence. Eckhurch found extensive documentary references spanning several centuries of pre-industrial European life to what people at the time called first sleep and second sleep, two distinct sleep periods separated by an hour or more of quiet wakeful activity in the middle of the night. Prayer, quiet conversation, sometimes visiting neighbors, before returning to sleep until dawn. Eckhurch's research connects the eventual disappearance of this segmented sleep pattern directly to the spread of artificial lighting, first through cheaper candles and oil lamps, and later through electric light, which pushed bedtimes progressively later and compressed what had been two distinct sleep periods into the single consolidated block, now treated as biologically normal. That detail lands with real weight once placed next to Siegel's Hadza, San, and Tissimini data. because it means the segmented, interrupted sleep architecture wasn't unique to remote hunter-gatherer populations living in hot climates. Eckertsch's evidence shows the same underlying pattern persisting in ordinary European households right up until artificial light became cheap and widespread, suggesting this may be closer to the actual default human sleep architecture, present until very recently even in populations with agriculture, clocks, and organized society, and only erased in the last 2 centuries or so by the specific historical arrival of reliable artificial lighting. Here's the part worth pausing on directly, because it challenges an assumption embedded in a huge amount of modern wellness advice. Nowhere in this data is there evidence of ancient humans going to sleep at nightfall, sleeping a rigid 8 hours and waking automatically at a fixed time, regardless of season. What Siegel's and Eckertsch's research together actually document is a system exquisitely responsive to real-time environmental cues, light, temperature, and social activity, adjusting fluidly night to night and across seasons, rather than following any fixed external rule at all. The modern advice to get exactly 8 consolidated hours of sleep on a fixed nightly schedule may itself be closer to an artificial, clock-derived, and light-derived approximation of something the ancestral system did far more responsively, and according to Siegel's data, unmeasurably less total sleep time than most people assume they need today. Now zoom out across the entire day just walked through, from the staggered pre-dawn waking with no alarm, through several hours of morning foraging split along fairly consistent lines between men and women, through a midday lull driven by heat and physiology rather than schedule, through an afternoon of lighter tool work and largely unsupervised child learning, through play, through an evening transformed entirely by firelight into an extended, cross-generational block of storytelling and cultural transmission, and finally into a flexible, temperature-responsive sleep period lasting measurably less than 8 hours, sometimes broken into distinct segments entirely. Almost none of this was imposed by any external authority. There was no employer setting a start time, no institution mandating an 8-hour sleep target, no artificial light overriding the dawn signal, no age-segregated evening activities pulling grandparents and grandchildren into separate rooms. It is worth remembering at this point just how long this general shape of a day actually persisted. Modern clock-based scheduling in anything resembling its current form is at most a few centuries old, and the widespread availability of artificial light bright enough to meaningfully override the dawn signal Chasler's research describes is barely a century and a half old in most of the world. Set against that timeline, a day organized primarily around dawnlight, midday heat, evening firelight, and elder-led storytelling isn't simply one option among several equally weighted ancient alternatives. It is, by a very wide margin, the version of a human day that has existed the longest, the version every other version has had to compete against, and displace in a comparatively tiny sliver of the species' total time on the planet. The modern day runs on almost none of these original signals. Waking is controlled by an alarm rather than dawnlight, a substitution Chasler's research suggests actively fights against rather than works with the body's evolved wake mechanism. Work hours are fixed by external schedule rather than by task completion or heat, producing, according to Lee and Solons's data, a far higher total weekly labor burden than the 15 to 20-hour range documented among the Jew hoansi. Evening hours are extended by artificial light well past the point firelight would have naturally begun winding an ancestral evening down toward sleep. And that extended evening is spent, for a large share of the modern population, not in cross-generational storytelling around a shared fire, but in solitary or age-segregated screen time, an activity that occupies functionally the same time slot fire once opened up, without providing anything like the same social or cultural function Wisner's data documented. Consider the specific mechanics of that substitution for a moment, because it maps onto the framework this entire video has built with unusual precision. Fire, per Wrangham and Wisner's combined research, extended the day and specifically created conditions favorable to slow, imaginative, socially rich storytelling, precisely because it removed the visual stimulation and practical demands of full daylight while still providing enough light to remain active together. A modern screen, by contrast, provides light without removing stimulation. If anything, it multiplies it, delivering rapid visual and narrative input, engineered in much of commercial media and social platform design to maximize attention capture rather than to produce anything resembling Wisner's slow, cross-generational, elder-led storytelling format. The evening light source changed. The type of activity that light source encourages changed just as dramatically in something close to the opposite direction from what fire originally enabled. That comparison isn't included here to argue that modern life should abandon clocks, electric light, and fixed schedules entirely. Almost no one watching this would seriously argue for that. And it's worth being honest that the ancestral daily rhythm documented across this video existed inside conditions of real scarcity, real physical risk, and real environmental pressure that most people alive today would not willingly choose to return to. But it's also worth being honest that replacing an entire evolved environmentally responsive daily rhythm with an artificial clock-driven substitute without ever really deciding to, has left specific measurable gaps that Siegel's sleep data, E. Kirch's historical evidence, and Wisner's storytelling data all point toward directly. Shorter, more fragmented sleep than the body may actually be architected for, and evening hours increasingly emptied of the cross-generational story-based social function Fire once filled almost automatically every single night for nearly the entire span of human existence. Somewhere in northern Tanzania right now, as this video plays, the sun is moving through some part of its arc over Lake Eyasi, and somewhere nearby, in a Hadza camp, someone is either digging tubers in the mid-morning heat, resting through the flattest part of the afternoon, or sitting near a fire as the light fails, waiting for the evening stories to begin, following a rhythm that has needed no invention, no upgrade, and no alarm clock for longer than almost anything else human beings still do.